Town meeting tonight! Town meeting tonight from Town Hall, New York!
The night was May 30th, 1935. The place, Town Hall, just off Manhattan's Times Square. On a network of 18 stations, now grown to 360, George V. Denny, Jr., the founder of America's Town Meeting of the Air, called the audience to order.
Friends and neighbors, we are meeting here tonight in the same spirit that prompted our ancestors more than 150 years ago to meet together in the town halls of America to discuss their common problems. Today, a marvelous new instrument has been placed in our hands, the radio. Through it, we are able to recapture one of our finest institutions, the town meeting. Once confined to purely local matters, it may, by means of the radio, become a national institution, a town meeting of the air.
So began this pioneer experiment in the use of radio as a sounding board for public opinion. This was the era of the New Deal, with its inherent struggle between government and business. In January 1938, trust-busting Assistant Attorney General Robert H. Jackson shared the town meeting platform with a man who was destined to be a Republican candidate for President of the United States. This was Wendell Willkie's first nationwide broadcast. Mr. Jackson spoke first.
The greatest difference between the man I meet in government and the man I meet in business is this. The man who is in government looks at society, if he does his duty, as a whole mechanism, rather than specializing the interest of a single business. The private businessman, on the other hand, up to now has been intensely preoccupied with a very narrow sector of the world.
Little dreaming that 2 years hence he would run for the presidency, Wendell Willkie pleaded for harmony between government and business.
In such a time as this, when we see the relief rolls lengthening again and the price of farm products declining, when many of us are discouraged, surely government and business should put an end to the bitternesses of recent years.
A dark cloud loomed over the horizon. The sound of the goose step on the cobblestone streets of Europe grew louder and more foreboding. Neville Chamberlain returned to London from Munich with peace in our time, and Nazi troops entered Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and then Prague. One by one, the lights went out in Europe. But was this our war? We were hearing from isolationists on one side, from interventionists on the other. Remember America First? Town meeting posed the question, is a Hitler defeat essential to the United States? Speaking for the affirmative was a Washington lawyer, later to rise to the position of Secretary of State. Dean Acheson was little known to the nation on that night in January 1941 when he said,
"A victory for Hitler would mean that Hitler would absorb his feeble ally Mussolini, and with Japan would control Europe and Africa and Asia. A victorious Axis would have unlimited military and air power. Most important of all, we should be faced with a world holding and spreading by insidious propaganda a fanatical faith that the moral and ethical foundations of our life is nonsense. It is essential to the United States that the possibility of such a future be prevented by the only sure prevention, a Hitler defeat."
Challenging Dean Acheson was a newspaperman from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, chairman of the No Foreign War Committee, Vern Marshall.
Permit me to say that the one immediate need for us Americans to ensure that our country is not wrecked by involvement in this same old European economic, political, and ideological, not democratic war is to instruct the Congress to take our orders to that effect. Keep out of this war.
But could we remain on the sidelines? Then came a dramatic moment in Town Hall. Wendell Willkie, who had campaigned the year before on an isolationist platform, was in the audience and was invited to reply to Mr. Thomas.
If I believe that Britain could collapse and America could survive, then I would not take a single risk in involving this country in any international entanglements. But if, on the other hand, I believed, as I do believe, that if Britain collapses, within a few years the free way of life will pass from America, and even I, who opposed the election of Franklin Roosevelt with all the resources of my being, would grant to him such extraordinary power as we shall not preserve this great standard of living in America by withdrawing within ourselves. And I, who oppose Franklin Roosevelt, I call upon all Americans to give him such power in this most severe crisis, I believe, in the history of America, so that he may save America, so that we can debate with him again in another election.
11 months later came Pearl Harbor, and political adversaries personally were united with but one objective: victory over the forces of tyranny and aggression. With the end of World War II, both the victorious and the vanquished nations were confronted with tremendous problems, many of which today remain unsolved. For one, millions of people in the world still are hungry. New York's fiery yet much beloved Mayor Fiorello Guardia told listeners of his responsibilities as director of a new agency, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA.
Time does not permit me to give you the terrifying and horrible statistics of hardship at this very moment. Oh, it's a heartbreaking job. There just isn't enough food in the world today. We have to distribute it. There will not be enough for everybody. There will not be sufficient to satisfy anybody. But I shall insist that the helpless, the weak, these suffering, hungry millions get a fair share of the available supply.
There were doubts even then, in the immediate post-war years, as to the stability of world peace. There were troubled spots in many areas of the globe when Town Meeting embarked on its unprecedented world tour in 1949. Accompanied by 28 representative Americans, the program visited 12 capital cities from London to Tokyo. Most memorable in that series, and perhaps the most significant today, was the statement of Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister of India, speaking on Town Meeting from New Delhi.
I wish to extend my greeting to you, members of the Town Meeting of the Air, and to welcome you to this ancient city of Delhi, which has experienced many thousands of years of human history. All of us, and more especially we in Asia, are confronted by great and basic problems which demand urgent attention. Essentially, these problems are how to raise the living standards and well-being of our masses, how to provide them the primary necessities for a civilized existence. Democracy has to find a solution for these problems, for they cannot wait for some future date. Our approach, therefore, has to be in terms of what benefits and raises the common man and woman. Therefore, democracy has to extend its scope from the purely political to other fields so as to find a solution for these vital problems. I commend you to your labors.
As in a period of 10 years before, when America watched with anxiety the developments on the continent of Europe, our eyes shifted now to the Far East. At this half-century mark, an island in the Pacific was claiming page one headlines. Formosa was a controversial hotspot. California Senator William F. Noland summarized his stand on Formosan defense.
Because a free China existing on the island of Formosa is important to the ultimate freedom of all China, because the conquest of Formosa by communism would have a disastrous psychological effect throughout Asia and the world, and because Formosa in the unfriendly hands of international communism would jeopardize our strategic defense position in the Far East and place our defenses in this age of the airplane and the atomic weapon back on the Pacific coast, I believe that it is essential that communism be checked in Formosa. By so doing, we may save not only Asia, but the whole free world.
Now we were again at war in Korea. These were the months of the great debate. Two other United States senators sharing the town meeting rostrum in May 1951 discussed our Far East policies, and 15 months later, these same two men were to become rival candidates for the vice presidency. First, Senator Richard M. Nixon.
General MacArthur was fired because he suggested steps which he said could and should be taken to bring military victory on the battlefield. But Secretary Acheson and the administration, in opposing the steps General MacArthur recommends, have consistently failed to offer any alternative program of their own.
With another view, Senator John Sparkman.
Now, the President did not fire General MacArthur because he suggested a plan. The reason General MacArthur was fired was this. Under our setup, we have a Joint Chiefs of Staff whose job it is to plan strategy and to plan our military operations. Our Joint Chiefs of Staff did make their plans, and General MacArthur was not willing to fall in line with those plans and those orders that were given to him by our Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that is the reason the President felt that there was no other alternative except to relieve General MacArthur from his command.
The war in Korea dragged on and finally was ended. Thomas E. Dewey, appearing on town meeting shortly after his return from the Far East in 1952, summarized his impressions with these words.
You can't keep a free world if you only keep pieces of it. The great crisis in this world is whether it's going to be strong enough so that the Soviet Union can be stopped from getting a good bite per annum. I want, most desperately, for the sake of keeping this country alive and free, which is the most important thing in the world, to avoid World War III by having enough strength on our side so that it won't happen, because dictators don't usually start wars they expect to lose. And I want to be so strong that Stalin will not, or his successor, will not start a war he can lose. One of the ways is to keep that 300 million people on our side.
War and threats of war across the Pacific, and at home, legislation for social welfare. In the 30s, we called it the New Deal. In the 40s, it was known as the welfare state. An eloquent spokesman for the Democratic administrations of Roosevelt and Truman, former Interior Secretary Oscar L. Chapman, stated the case for his party.
The complexity of modern society and the growing dependency of the individual upon society has necessarily increased the need to promote the general welfare and to secure the blessings of liberty. We have attempted to assure for the majority of the people a fair share in the economic output and wealth of this nation.
A staunch defender of the free enterprise system, the late Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio disagreed with Mr. Chapman.
If we permit the federal government, particularly the federal government, take over all welfare services, furnish them free to all the people of this country, we will destroy the personal liberty of those people. If we adopt a national system by which at a huge cost the government attempts to give free medical service to all the people, if we adopt a system in which they give free housing to practically all the people, then that will defeat our own purpose and will limit the people's ability to spend the money which they earn in the sweat of their brow, because the government will insist that you give all of your money finally to the government and permit the government to decide what services and what things you shall get for your money.
Throughout the years, juvenile delinquency has been one of the more frequently discussed social problems. In the words of Father Edward J. Flanagan,
people everywhere are asking what is wrong with our boys and girls. I would like to tell you what is wrong with our parents and society. The time has come for us to stop acting like the complacent Mr. Dewey, who confided that everybody is queer but me and thee. And sometimes I think thee is a little queer. Punishing our boys and girls will not eliminate the cause of their mistakes. A stronger padlock does not make a better boy. Our unfortunate children are spiritually sick. We do not attempt to eliminate yellow fever by pouring kerosene on the victim. We pour it on the water where the mosquito breeds. Let us stop blaming juveniles for their mistakes and put the responsibility where it belongs, on parents and society.
On a lighter note, town meeting in 1948 turned its attention to another side of our social life, one closely related by many to the problem of delinquency. What's wrong with the comics? Cartoonist Al Capp.
This whole thing gives me an idea for one of my own contributions to juvenile delinquency, which I call, rather defiantly, my comic strip. The scene is a typical American home of a typical American family named Kinsey, of course. Supper is over, and seated in the living room are Mr. and Mrs. Kinsey and their 11-year-old son, King's Blood. They're discussing what they've read in that day's typical American newspaper. Little King's Blood has gone through all that, and frankly, it bored him. He's reading the one page of the family newspaper where there's real action, the comic page. Mrs. Kinsey, noticing that little King's Blood isn't joining in this uplifting discussion of the front page of their family newspaper, glances over his shoulder and screams a typical, horrified American mother-type scream. "Look," she screams to Mr. Kinsey, "look at what your child is reading. Why, this thing is full of murder, crime, violence, and look. There's even a boy in it who doesn't think that a girl in it is repulsive, so it's full of sex, too." Mr. Kinsey speaks. He says, "Why do you bother with that old comic page anyhow, son? Why don't you read the news, son? It's a son," he's talking. And "I did, Pop," replies the lad, "and oh boy, it's all full of murder, crime, violence," and he winks an sex, too, Pop.
As this town meeting cavalcade looks back upon 20 years, we have focused the spotlight of free and unfettered discussion upon a multitude of events. Many of the issues and problems which existed in the beginning remain with us. In some cases, the scene has shifted, but the basic problem still cries out for solution. The most monumental of all, peace for mankind. Can we achieve this dream of peace in our lifetime? Where lies our hope, our courage? Let us turn to town meeting guests in other years and hear again their words. The great historian, Arnold J. Toynbee.
I would say we cannot foretell, but it depends on ourselves. That is the struggle that is going on inside the heart of every one of us, because it's what happens inside each individual that finally determines what happens to the communities and to the whole of society.
We have heard again some of the memorable moments in town meetings 20 years, the heat of debate, the light of knowledge, 20 years dedicated to the advancement of an informed America.